It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon on Oak Street when everything changed. The clock had just struck 2:30 p.m., and the streets were getting busy with parents heading to pick up their kids from school. A white police cruiser sat hidden behind the old maple tree near Wilson's corner store, its driver more focused on his target than the actual task of keeping the community safe. Officer Richards wasn't having a good day. His divorce papers had arrived that morning, his coffee had spilled on his uniform, and now he was determined to make someone else's day just as miserable. That's when he spotted the blue Honda Civic, driven by a woman in her early 30s, following all traffic rules perfectly. Something about her driving irked him. Maybe it was how carefully she stopped at the yellow light, or how she used her turn signal well in advance. Whatever it was, he already decided she was going to be his next traffic stop. He pulled out from his hiding spot, flashing his lights in his rearview mirror. The woman, a beloved high school chemistry teacher who'd just finished grading papers during her free period, felt her heart sink as she saw the flashing lights. She did everything by the book, pulled over to the right, turned off her engine, placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and waited. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer approach. His walk was aggressive, his hand already resting on his belt. She could feel something wasn't right. The teacher had dealt with traffic stops before. They were usually routine, professional. But this felt different. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with the usual police greeting. His voice was filled with unnecessary anger, his face twisted into a scowl that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with his personal problems. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" she asked politely, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She taught her students about their rights, about staying calm in difficult situations. Now it was time to practice what she preached. That simple, legal question set him off. Officer Richards's face turned red, and he yanked the door handle. "Get out of the car, now," he shouted, loud enough for the growing number of onlookers to hear. People had started gathering outside the corner store, phones raised, recording what they could sense was about to become a serious situation. The teacher kept her composure, though her hands were shaking. "Officer, I have the right to know why I'm being stopped. I've done nothing wrong." She tried to maintain her dignity, her professionalism, but the officer wasn't interested in rights or reason. What happened next would change not just their lives, but the entire community's perspective on law enforcement. As more witnesses gathered and cameras started rolling, Officer Richards made a decision that would end his career and start a movement for change in their small town. He reached for her car door, his rage completely overtaking his training and judgment. The next few moments would be captured on dozens of phones, shared across social media, and become the catalyst for a long overdue conversation about power, respect, and accountability in their community. What happened next felt like slow motion to everyone watching. Officer Richards grabbed the car door handle and yanked it open with such force that it bounced back, nearly hitting him. The teacher still sat there, hands trembling but determined to stand her ground. She was scared, but she knew her rights. "I said get out," he bellowed, his face now bright red with anger. Without warning, he reached in and grabbed her arm. The teacher, who'd spent the last decade teaching kids about respect and dignity, was being treated like a criminal for simply asking a question. "Please, officer, you're hurting me," she cried out, her voice shaking but clear enough for the growing crowd to hear. Her phone, which had been recording the entire interaction as she'd learned to do in a community safety workshop, clattered to the floor of her car. The crowd outside Wilson's corner store had grown larger. Mrs. Wilson herself, who'd known the teacher for years, stood at the front, her hand covering her mouth in horror. Next to her, a retired police officer who lived down the street started making urgent phone calls to people he knew at the department. Officer Richards didn't seem to care about the witnesses. Maybe he didn't even notice them anymore. His rage had taken over completely as he pulled the teacher from her car. Her sensible work shoes scraped against the pavement as she tried to keep her balance. her lesson plans and carefully graded papers scattered across the street, carried away by the afternoon breeze. "Look at what you made me do," he shouted, as if it was her fault that her belongings were now scattered everywhere. But his words were drowned out by the gasps and shouts from the onlookers. Someone in the crowd yelled that they were calling 911. Another person mentioned that they knew the police chief personally. The retired officer, still on his phone, moved closer. "Son," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "you need to step back and think about what you're doing." But Officer Richards was too far gone to listen to reason. The teacher stood there, her back against her car, trying to maintain her composure despite the situation. She taught her students about staying calm under pressure, about dignity in the face of injustice. Now she was living those lessons in front of an audience of horrified neighbors and strangers. "I want your badge number," she said firmly, even as her legs shook beneath her. "And I want your supervisor here right now." Her words seemed to pierce through Officer Richards' anger for just a moment. He blinked, perhaps finally realizing that dozens of phones were recording his every move. But instead of backing down, he reached for his handcuffs. That's when the sound of screeching tires caught everyone's attention. A police supervisor's car had just turned the corner, lights flashing. Help was arriving, but the damage to community trust was already done. The crowd held their breath. The next few moments would either make things much worse or start the process of making them better. The teacher stood tall, her dignity intact despite everything. She knew that what happened next wouldn't just affect her. It would affect her students, her community, and maybe even help change things for the better. The police supervisor's car pulled up just as Officer Richards was reaching for his handcuffs. Lieutenant Brown, a 20-year veteran of the force, stepped out and quickly sized up the situation. She'd known Richards was having personal problems, but this was beyond anything she'd expected. "Officer, stand down." Her voice cut through the tension like a knife. The crowd fell silent, phones still recording every moment. The teacher remained frozen against her car, her heart pounding but relief starting to show in her eyes. The retired judge who'd been recording everything stepped forward. "Lieutenant, I've got the whole thing on video." This officer dragged her out of the car for simply asking why she was stopped. His voice carried the weight of authority, and several other witnesses nodded in agreement. Lieutenant Brown's face darkened as she watched the first few seconds of the footage. She'd spent years building trust between the police and the community, and in just a few minutes, Officer Richards had threatened to undo all of that work. "Officer Richards, give me your badge and gun. Right now." The lieutenant's tone left no room for argument. For a moment, it looked like Richards might refuse. His hands trembled, and sweat beaded on his forehead. But finally, reality seemed to sink in. He slowly unclipped his badge and handed over his weapon. The teacher, still shaken but standing tall, watched as another patrol car arrived. Two officers she recognized from community outreach programs stepped out. They'd visited her classroom last month to talk to her students about civic responsibility and mutual respect. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Brown approached her gently, "I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. This is not how we train our officers, and this is not how we serve our community." The sincerity in her voice was clear to everyone watching. Mrs. Wilson from the corner store had already brought out a chair and a bottle of water. The teacher sat down, taking small sips as her hands gradually stopped shaking. Around her, neighbors and strangers alike offered words of support and shared their recordings of the incident. "I want to press charges," the teacher said firmly, her voice stronger now. "Not for revenge, but because we need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The lieutenant nodded, understanding perfectly. Officer Richards stood by his patrol car, the fight gone out of him. He watched as his colleagues treated the teacher with the respect he should have shown from the beginning. Some of the onlookers noticed tears in his eyes, not from remorse, but from finally realizing the consequences of his actions. The retired judge was already on the phone with the police chief, describing what he'd witnessed. Other officers had arrived to help collect statements from witnesses. What started as an abuse of power was turning into a moment of community solidarity. The teacher looked at her scattered papers on the ground. Lesson plans about civil rights and citizenship that seemed more relevant now than ever. A couple of high school students who recognized her from school had already started gathering them up, carefully putting them back in order. This wasn't just going to be a story about one bad officer anymore. It was becoming a story about a community standing up for what's right, about accountability, and about how proper police work should really look. Back at the police station, things were moving quickly. The police chief sat at his desk, his face grim as he watched the videos that had already started spreading across social media. His phone hadn't stopped ringing, calls from the mayor, local news stations, and community leaders all wanting answers. "Get me everything on Officer Richards," he told his assistant. "Every complaint, every evaluation, every training record." The chief had always believed that one bad officer could destroy years of community trust. Now he was watching it happen in real time. Meanwhile, the teacher sat in the lieutenant's office, a cup of hot tea in her hands. Her principal had come to support her, along with two other teachers who'd rushed over after hearing what happened. The room felt safe, but her hands still shook slightly when she recalled the incident. "I want you to know," Lieutenant Brown said, sitting across from her, "that we're taking this very seriously. Internal Affairs is already reviewing the body cam footage, and we have dozens of witness statements." She paused, making sure her next words carried their full weight. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. Outside the station, a small crowd had gathered. Not in anger or protest, but in support. Some held signs reading "Protect our teachers" and "Police accountability matters." Local news vans lined the street, their reporters talking about how this incident was different, how the department's immediate response showed what real accountability looked like. The retired judge who'd witnessed everything had stayed to give his statement. His presence in the station carried extra weight. He presided over countless police cases during his career. "This is exactly how these situations should be handled," he told the investigating officers. "Swift action, full transparency." In another room, Officer Richards sat alone, his badge and gun gone. Through the window, he could see his own face on the TV news. The anger that had driven him earlier was replaced by something else now, the crushing realization of what he'd done. The teacher's students had heard about what happened. Messages of support flooded her phone. "Mrs. T, we saw the video. You stood up for your rights just like you taught us." One message read. Another said, "Our class is with you. You showed us how to be brave." The police chief called an emergency meeting with his command staff. "This stops now," he said, spreading out Richards's file on the table. "We're going to use this incident to make real changes. New training protocols, better screening, more community involvement in our oversight." Lieutenant Brown returned to her office where the teacher was giving her official statement. "The department will cover any medical expenses," she assured her. "And we'll need you to attend some hearings, but we'll work around your teaching schedule." The teacher nodded, then straightened her shoulders. "I want to be part of the solution," she said. Maybe this can be turned into something positive. A lesson for both the police and the community." Outside, the afternoon sun was setting. News helicopters circled overhead, and more community members had gathered. But unlike similar incidents in other cities, this crowd was different. They weren't there to protest. They were there to witness change happening in real time, to make sure promises of accountability were kept. This wasn't the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. A beginning that would lead to real changes in how the police department operated, how officers were trained, and how the community and law enforcement worked together. The next morning, the Internal Affairs investigation was moving at record speed. Investigators sat in a conference room, surrounded by screens showing different angles of the incident. The body cam footage was particularly damning. capturing every unnecessary command, every aggressive move Officer Richards had made. "Look at this," one investigator said, pointing to a timestamp. "He never even told her why she was pulled over." Another investigator was going through Richards's past records, finding a pattern that should have raised red flags months ago. 3 complaints in the past year, all involving similar aggressive behavior. The police chief held an emergency press conference in front of the station. Camera lights flashed as he stood at the podium, his expression serious but determined. "We've seen the videos. We've heard the witnesses. And I want to make one thing absolutely clear. This behavior has no place in our police force." Back at the high school, the teacher's classroom was full, but not with her regular students. Community leaders, school administrators, and police oversight committee members sat in student desks, listening as she shared her experience. Her voice was steady now, stronger than ever. "What happened to me wasn't just about one officer," she explained. "It's about the systems we put in place to prevent these incidents, and what we do when they fail." Her words carried extra weight coming from someone who taught civics and civil rights to the next generation. The local news had picked up an interesting angle. Turns out the teacher had been developing a curriculum about citizen rights and police interaction. "Sometimes life gives you the hardest tests," she told the reporter. "But these are lessons our whole community needs to learn." Officer Richards's union representative sat across from him, reviewing the evidence. "I'll be honest with you," he said, closing the folder. "With the video evidence and witness statements, fighting this would only make things worse." Richards nodded slowly, finally seeming to understand the gravity of his actions. Community members had started organizing. The retired judge was working with local leaders to establish a civilian review board with real power. Mrs. Wilson from the corner store had turned her shop into an informal meeting place where people discussed ways to improve police-community relations. The teacher's students were taking action too. They organized a peaceful gathering after school, holding signs that read, "Knowledge is power," and "Know your rights." Local TV stations interviewed some of them, impressed by their mature understanding of the situation. Lieutenant Brown was making changes of her own. She'd started reviewing every traffic stop report from the past 6 months, looking for patterns. "We can't change what happened," she told her team, "but we can make sure it never happens again." In the teacher's classroom, her famous Rights and Responsibilities poster seemed to stand out more than ever. Students from other classes started dropping by during lunch, asking questions about what to do during traffic stops. She turned these conversations into teachable moments. The investigation was thorough but quick. By the end of the day, Internal Affairs had compiled enough evidence to make their recommendation. The chief's decision would come soon, but everyone already knew this wasn't going to be just another slap on the wrist. What started as a terrifying traffic stop was turning into something bigger. It was becoming a moment of change, a case study in how communities could respond to injustice with unity and purpose rather than division and anger. 3 days after the incident, the community center was packed. People filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. The police chief had called for a town hall meeting, but this felt different from the usual bureaucratic gatherings. There was energy in the room, a sense that real change was possible. The teacher sat in the front row, surrounded by her colleagues and students. She'd spent the morning in her classroom, teaching about civic engagement. Now she was watching her lessons come to life. Her bruised arm was healing, but the determination in her eyes was stronger than ever. "What happened on Tuesday wasn't just a failure of one officer," the chief began, his voice carrying through the packed room. "It was a wake-up call for our entire department." He clicked a button, and images appeared on the screen behind him. New training programs, updated policies, community oversight plans. In the audience, the retired judge nodded approvingly. He'd spent the past few days helping draft new guidelines for traffic stops. Every officer will be required to clearly state the reason for the stop before asking for any documents, the chief explained. "It's not just policy, it's about respect." Officer Richards's empty chair sat on the stage, a visible reminder of accountability. The chief had insisted on it being there. Yesterday, after a thorough investigation, Officer Richards was officially terminated from our force, he announced. The room stayed quiet, but you could feel the collective exhale. The teacher's students had created a presentation of their own. They'd spent their free periods researching successful police reform in other cities. Now their work was being shown to the whole community. Our kids are teaching us, someone whispered, and heads nodded in agreement. Lieutenant Brown stood up to present the new community engagement program. Starting next week, we're expanding our ride-along program. We want you to see how we work, and we want to hear your ideas for improvement. The sign-up sheets at the back of the room were already filling up. Mrs. Wilson from the corner store raised her hand during the Q&A. How will we know these changes are really happening? She asked. The chief's response was immediate. Because you'll be part of the process. We're forming a civilian oversight committee, and we want everyday citizens involved. The local news cameras captured it all. But unlike the usual stories about police incidents, this one was different. This was about a community coming together, about turning a negative incident into positive change. The reporter noticed how people from all parts of town were sitting together, sharing ideas. Near the end of the meeting, the teacher walked to the podium. The room fell silent. What happened to me was wrong, she began, her voice clear and strong. But what's happening now, this response, this unity, these changes, this is right. This is how we build trust. She pulled out some papers from her bag, the same lesson plans that had scattered across the street during her traffic stop. I teach my students that change starts with understanding. That justice requires action. That community means standing together. Her words brought tears to many eyes. The meeting ran longer than planned, but nobody seemed to mind. People lingered afterwards, forming small groups, exchanging contact information, signing up for various community programs. The police officers who attended in uniform were engaged in real conversations with citizens. What had started as a traumatic traffic stop was transforming into something powerful, a blueprint for how communities could work together to create real, lasting change. And at the center of it all was a teacher who turned her worst day into a lesson everyone needed to learn. 3 days after the incident, the community center was packed. People filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. The police chief had called for a town hall meeting, but this felt different from the usual bureaucratic gatherings. There was energy in the room, a sense that real change was possible. The teacher sat in the front row, surrounded by her colleagues and students. She'd spent the morning in her classroom, teaching about civic engagement. Now she was watching her lessons come to life. Her bruised arm was healing, but the determination in her eyes was stronger than ever. What happened on Tuesday wasn't just a failure of one officer, the chief began, his voice carrying through the packed room. It was a wake-up call for our entire department. He clicked a button, and images appeared on the screen behind him. New training programs, updated policies, community oversight plans. In the audience, the retired judge nodded approvingly. He'd spent the past few days helping draft new guidelines for traffic stops. Every officer will be required to clearly state the reason for the stop before asking for any documents, the chief explained. It's not just policy, it's about respect. Officer Richards's empty chair sat on the stage, a visible reminder of accountability. The chief had insisted on it being there. Yesterday, after a thorough investigation, Officer Richards was officially terminated from our force, he announced. The room stayed quiet, but you could feel the collective exhale. The teacher's students had created a presentation of their own. They'd spent their free periods researching successful police reform in other cities. Now their work was being shown to the whole community. Our kids are teaching us, someone whispered, and heads nodded in agreement. Lieutenant Brown stood up to present the new community engagement program. Starting next week, we're expanding our ride-along program. We want you to see how we work, and we want to hear your ideas for improvement. The sign-up sheets at the back of the room were already filling up. Mrs. Wilson from the corner store raised her hand during the Q&A. "How will we know these changes are really happening?" she asked. The chief's response was immediate. "Because you'll be part of the process. We're forming a civilian oversight committee, and we want everyday citizens involved." The local news cameras captured it all. But unlike the usual stories about police incidents, this one was different. This was about a community coming together, about turning a negative incident into positive change. The reporter noticed how people from all parts of town were sitting together, sharing ideas. Near the end of the meeting, the teacher walked to the podium. The room fell silent. "What happened to me was wrong," she began, her voice clear and strong. "But what's happening now? This response, this unity, these changes, this is right. This is how we build trust." She pulled out some papers from her bag, the same lesson plans that had scattered across the street during her traffic stop. "I teach my students that change starts with understanding. That justice requires action. That community means standing together." Her words brought tears to many eyes. The meeting ran longer than planned, but nobody seemed to mind. People lingered afterwards, forming small groups, exchanging contact information, signing up for various community programs. The police officers who attended in uniform were engaged in real conversations with citizens. What had started as a traumatic traffic stop was transforming into something powerful. A blueprint for how communities could work together to create real, lasting change. And at the center of it all was a teacher who turned her worst day into a lesson everyone needed to learn. 2 weeks had passed, and the changes were becoming permanent. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the police training center as 30 officers sat in a classroom. Not for a typical briefing, but for something new. The teacher stood at the front, no longer afraid, but empowered. "Today, we're going to talk about what it feels like on both sides of a traffic stop," she began. The officers leaned forward, some taking notes. This wasn't just another mandatory training. This was real-world experience from someone who'd lived through their worst and was helping create their best. Outside the training center, news vans had gathered again. But this time, they weren't covering a scandal. "Local police department becomes national model for reform," read the headline on the reporter's notebook. They filmed as community members walked in and out, now regular participants in police training. The retired judge watched from the back of the room. He'd helped design this new training program, combining his legal expertise with the teacher's experience. "We're not just teaching procedures," he told a visiting police chief from another city. "We're changing the whole culture." In the hallway, Lieutenant Brown was showing visitors the new monitoring system. Every traffic stop was now reviewed, not just the ones that went wrong. "Look here," she pointed to a screen. "Officers who get the most positive community feedback share one thing. They take time to explain and listen." The teacher's students had become part of the change too. They'd created role-play scenarios for police training, showing officers how young people feel during stops. "When you're nervous, even simple questions can be scary," one student explained to a group of officers. The officers nodded, understanding. Down at the corner store, Mrs. Wilson had started a new tradition. Every Friday, officers would stop by for coffee and conversation with locals. Today, they were discussing the success of the new approach. "Haven't had a single complaint about traffic stops in 2 weeks," one officer said proudly. The police chiefs sat in on today's training session. He watched as officers asked questions, shared concerns, and really listened to the teacher's perspective. This is what rebuilding trust looks like, he thought, remembering how close they'd come to losing that trust completely. During a break, the teacher checked her phone. Messages poured in from teachers in other cities, asking about her curriculum. What started in one classroom was spreading across the country. "Your experience is helping change things everywhere," her principal had told her that morning. The local college had taken notice too. They invited the teacher to help design a new course for criminal justice students. "We want future officers to learn these lessons before they ever put on a badge," the department head explained. The teacher thought about how much safer her students' future could be. Back in the training room, an officer raised his hand. "I've been on the force for 15 years, he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I never really saw it from the other side before." Around him, other officers nodded in agreement. The old ways of thinking were changing, one mind at a time. As the afternoon session wrapped up, community members started arriving for the evening program. The department had opened its training to the public, creating a space where citizens and police could learn from each other. Tonight's topic: building trust through understanding. The incident that started it all could have torn the community apart. Instead, it had brought people together in ways no one expected. As the teacher gathered her materials, she smiled at an officer who held the door for her. "See you next week," he asked. "Wouldn't miss it," she replied. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The morning sun lit up the auditorium of the State Police Academy, where hundreds of officers and community leaders from across the country had gathered. The teacher stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, both uniforms and civilians. "Change doesn't always come easily," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to show us the way forward." In the front row, her students beamed with pride. They'd helped turn their teacher's traumatic experience into a nationwide movement for positive change. The police chief sat on stage, ready to present the department's impressive new statistics. Traffic stop complaints had dropped to near zero. Community trust ratings had soared. Other cities were calling daily, wanting to learn their secrets. But it wasn't really a secret. It was simply about treating people with dignity and respect. Lieutenant Brown scrolled through her tablet, showing visitors the new police training app they'd developed. Inspired by the teacher's curriculum, it included real-world scenarios, community feedback, and clear guidelines for every type of interaction. "This all started with one traffic stop," she explained. "Now it's changing how we train officers everywhere." Down at the corner store, Mrs. Wilson had turned her community bulletin board into a success story wall. Pictures showed officers and citizens working together, attending community events, solving problems as partners rather than adversaries. The old tension between police and public was fading into history. The retired judge, now heading the Civilian Oversight Committee, shared their latest findings. "We're not just preventing bad incidents," he explained to the crowd. "We're creating positive ones. Every traffic stop is an opportunity to build trust." Officers in the audience nodded. They'd seen it work firsthand. The teacher's classroom had become a regular stop for new police recruits. Today, a fresh group sat among her students, learning about rights and responsibilities from both perspectives. "Understanding starts with listening," she told them. "And respect goes both ways." Even Officer Richards' story had found a purpose. His body camera footage, once evidence of misconduct, was now used in training sessions across the country, showing officers exactly what not to do and how quickly things can go wrong when power is abused. The local news station was doing a special report, 6 months later, how one incident changed policing. They interviewed community members, officers, and students. Everyone had a story about how things had improved. "It's like we're all on the same team now," one resident said. At the police station, the walls displayed a new mission statement, crafted with community input. "Serve, protect, respect," it read in bold letters. Below it hung photos of officers and citizens working together at various community events. The us versus them mentality had been replaced by a spirit of cooperation. The teacher wrapped up her speech with a story about a recent traffic stop, but this one was different. The officer had been one of her training participants. He'd explained everything clearly, shown respect, and turned a routine stop into a positive interaction. "This is what change looks like," she said, smiling. As the audience rose for a standing ovation, tears and smiles mixed in the crowd. What had started as a moment of fear and anger had transformed into something powerful, a model for how communities and police could work together to create real, lasting change. The teacher gathered her things, ready to head back to her classroom. Tomorrow would bring more students, more officers, more opportunities to spread this message of understanding and respect. Sometimes the hardest moments in life lead to the most important changes, and this change was just beginning.